So, thanks for coming to this evening's get together. This is going to be a first time that I'm teaching this particular course. It's based on a number of teachings that are traditional in the Galupa lineage, having to do with explanations that are available to us as Sutrayana practitioners about to enter Vajrayāna practice. But as I said in the course description, that this is beneficial, I feel. Certainly beneficial for me, even just preparing the material. Uh, Beneficial for people who are already practicing. No harm in ever refocusing, refreshing purpose uh, of the path of Vajrayana juxtaposed next to Sutrayana path. So I think there's a lot of benefit. And certainly as I prepared this material, it certainly felt that way to me. Um, but for those of you who don't know me too well, I do want to take a minute just to let you know that I have taught these materials before, just not in this specific context. I've studied these materials before. I've been practicing Vajrayana for almost 20 years, and then studying, doing the practices, and having mm, a firm clarity on the path and its value, and especially as a Western practitioner. So I'm hoping that for many of you who are like me, uh, and again, not only people who are maybe thinking about entering the tantric path, but also others who are already on the path, that this will be of benefit to you. Before I start the actual presentation, though, I'd like to know if you're comfortable. You don't have to actually say, but I'm assuming some of you are people who haven't uh, practiced Tantra yet. Would that be correct to say? Okay, yeah, some people shaking their heads. Good. Um, uh, I also would like to maybe get a feel that are some people, those people, um, coming to take a look at Tantra, having already been practicing what we call the common practices, the Sutrayana path, um, the Paramitayana path. I mean, basically, you are familiar, hopefully, with that part of the practice uh, that Buddhists are endeavoring. Would that be fair to say? Or do we have people who? Okay, so that's good. That's good to know. Um, then this is all part of how I want to filter things, even though our prepared material. Also, I want to set our intention. So before we go any further, I just like us to put ourselves in a quiet space as much as you can after the hecticness of the day, but don't fall asleep. Um, what I'd like to do, though, is just read to settle our minds collectively, a intention setting. Um, Short, not a meditation, but it just basically will set our intention for this evening. I am very fortunate to have a human life with the abundance of conducive conditions for spiritual practice, recognizing the many ways I depend on others, relatives, friends, those who provide me food and other necessities. I wish to use my life to benefit them and other beings in the world, and to avoid harming anyone. To fulfill this wish, I need to work on my mind, decreasing incorrect negative mental states and increasing positive ones. And this is my purpose for attending this session this evening. And may this session be beneficial for myself and everyone else. and may it be a cause for me to attain enlightenment in order to help all beings in the best possible way. So let's try to keep our mind in that frame, that anyone who's thinking of entering the tantric path or is on the tantric path should be expressing their interest in the context of bodhicitta, and hence the nature of that intention has that at its heart. So one other thing to say before I start with the presentation is I'd like everyone to feel comfortable to um, ask questions along the way. I'll try to pay attention to somebody was answering me on chat saying they came from the Theravadian tradition. So yeah, so I'll keep that in mind. And for you and also all of you, any questions you have as I'm presenting, because I tend to present in sort of a lecture format. I don't want that to be a barrier to asking questions. And if you feel like you want to wait to ask questions, I will be stopping artificially, so to speak, along the way to allow for people to ask questions where I think it might be beneficial to pause. But then also don't hesitate to raise your hand and or um, shout out even. I'm okay with that. Because I think it's important that we don't let anything slip by. So we're going to go ahead into the presentation now. And I will say that what you're going to hear tonight is something that is, in a way, very uh, much presents what I hope are the kinds of things that need to be put in focus for someone who's looking to enter the tantric path or just trying to learn about it at an initial phase. So some of this might be familiar to people who are already on the path, but again, I think it could be refreshing. So we'll start with just giving a definition of what Vajrayāna practice is. Um, Vajrayāna um, is also known as the Tantric path, and specifically, it's a branch of Mahayana Buddhism. It's based on the practice of the common fundamental vehicle or the Theravadian vehicle, which is the Four Truths, is taught in that school. That's foundational for all Buddhist practice, including Mahayana practice, and also for Vajrayana practice. So there's no difference so far. And it's infused with the heart of bodhicitta, which I already mentioned. Um, and it's also very, very reliant at its core on the wisdom realizing emptiness, dependent arising, and their complementary nature. So far, for those of you who are familiar with Mahayana Buddhism and Sutrayana practice, Paramitayana practice, that doesn't sound any different than that. But that's what we're going to explore here. We're going to explore that very closely in this session. And I'm going to try to pack a lot in. And then in the following sessions, we'll be talking more about some of the mechanics of entering the tantric path, such as empowerments, requirements, vows and commitments, what that all means. But what's most important is to put into focus the difference between Sutrayana and Vajrayana practice, and specifically what's important in both those practices. So even for some of you who haven't practiced maybe too much, even Sutrayana, or feel maybe not crystal clear about it, this presentation tonight will help, I think. So Vajrayana, very quickly, is principally practiced in Tibet, but it's also practiced in Mongolia, Japan, and it spread to China in ancient times, um, but it never became very popular there. So it all emanated in terms of Buddhist Tantra practice from India, and it really took hold alongside of Sutrayana practice in Tibet. It spread and became very popular at the same time. So this is one of the reasons why Buddhist Tantra or Vajrayāna practices are so robust and deep in the sense that they were adopted there and in a very rich way practice and thrived and come down to us today from that tradition. And that's really where keep your minds focused in that being where the context of the type of Vajrayana we're talking about. And Vajrayana is also known by different names: Tantrayana, Mantrayana, secret vehicle. And it's known to be secret not because it's fantastical and magical, although some people might think that, but it's very much a high-end technology for traveling the path that Buddhism offers. Um, but it's secret mostly because, to put it in its simplest form, you're not supposed to really share openly your practice of Vajrayana with others. So there's more I could say about that, but you're supposed to be really discreet. And maybe we'll talk more about that at another time. And secrecy is really meant on a practical level. I'll say one thing about secrecy to help protect your mind from indulging in the eight worldly thoughts. Um, that is one of those traps that are very primal to our experience of Tantra, where one could be prideful, one could feel like, very inappropriate in terms of self-grasping pride and in the context of the eight worldly thoughts specifically. So there's real good reason to do this. It's a good part of the practice. So Vajrayana, again, in general, involves visualizations of meditational deities um, and mandalas, which are the residence or environment of these deities, recitation of mantras, pujas, and other offerings. And being unfamiliar with Vajrayana teachings and practices, some people have kind of glamorized and really sort of have fantastical ideas about Vajrayana practice. But it's very important for us as modern Buddhist practitioners that we don't fall prey to any of these kinds of misconceptions. And that's fundamentally why we're offering this course at DNKL, because His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, has subscribed to making sure that practitioners who are entering or thinking about entering the tantric path have a clear view of what it is and how they might be, what they're getting involved with as a practice, how it compares to Sutrayana practice, and what's ahead of you in terms of commitments that you might undertake in the practice. And these are all things to be smartly informed about before you start the path, and also for us in practice to be reminded of it anew, if you will, kind of renewing that. And again, it has the same aims as I already mentioned as the Theravada practices. Um, it's rooted in those practices, like all Buddhist practices are. And the main goal is to uproot, literally uproot the afflictions that bind us in samsara. And that's no different than the Sutrayana practices of Mahayana Buddhism, um, and really to eradicate the afflictions that prevent us from reaching full awakening or Buddhahood. So that's kind of the 30,000-foot view. Next, I want to talk about the two aspects of practice that are both common to Sutrayana and Vajrayana that are super important to keep in mind. Um, One is called the method aspect, which is the aspiration to be free from samsara and generate bodhicitta. Um, and the other aspect is the wisdom aspect, which emphasizes understanding emptiness and impermanence. These two must be combined, whether you're traveling the Sutrayana path or the Vajrayāna path. Very, very, very important. Um, and then together, those two, along with developing what we call serenity, Jason Kappa calls it serenity. It's also known as shamatha, calm abiding, single-pointed meditation. It's the ability to remain focused on a meditational object. And this is very, very necessary to attaining enlightenment. Again, whether you're traveling the Sutrayana or Vajrayana path. So Tantrayana or Vajrayana has special methods for generating this meditative concentration and insight, which is the realization of emptiness. So the union of those two are what a practitioner is aiming for in doing tantric practice. And to do so much more quickly than the sutra path. And we'll be discovering tonight, like, why it's faster. Um, and this is one of the chief reasons the tantric path is highly praised because it has those techniques. So we further want to just put in practice, into focus, the path itself and where it comes from. So quickly, I'm going to just mention a quote from the Lalita Vistara Sutra, which is right after the Buddha has attained full awakening under the Bodhi tree. He says, profound and peaceful, free from elaboration, clear light, unconditioned. I have found a nectar-like Dharma. So here he's talking about the three turning of the wheels of Dharma. The first is encapsulated by him saying profound and peaceful. It refers to the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, where his main focus is on the Four Noble Truths. Um, and more than that, also dependent arising. And then free from elaboration indicates the second turning, where he includes the perfection of wisdom sutras. And these emphasize the ultimate nature of all persons and phenomena, their emptiness of inherent existence. Then the third, where he says clear light, unconditioned, refers to the third turning of the wheel. So, whereas the second turning of the wheel teaches on emptiness, the object, you got to remember this word object, object, clear light. He's teaching on emptiness, which is the object of meditation, the object clear light. And then in the third turning, he speaks of the cognizing subject, the one whose mind is actually the clear light mind that knows emptiness. These are two components that are taught in the second and third, and many other things taught. But as it relates to our course, these are the two I want you to remember. I want you to remember object clear light, and I want you to remember subject clear light and what they are. So this is very important. And then by speaking specifically about the subject clear light in the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha hints at Tantra because here is where he explains what's called the subtlest mind, um, the fundamental innate clear light mind, and how it manifests. Um, and this is really at the heart of tantric practice. Is that's the goal, is to make that innate clear light mind manifest. So in tantric teaching, and this is going to be really important to start to understand the difference between Sutrayana and Tantrayana. They talk about the coarse, subtle, and subtlest minds. The subtlest minds are something that manifest for us ordinary humans who don't practice Tantra, all beings experience what's called the dissolution at the time of death. And through the process of going through that dissolution, we're not going to talk about it in detail here. Um, one eventually sheds coarse levels of consciousness, of mind, and then the more subtle ones. And then the subtlest one, when it's manifest, is you're in the presence of the clear light innate mind. Ordinary people don't recognize that because they don't know that's what it is and they wouldn't know what to do with it. Tantric practice teaches us what to do with that, what to transform that into. And what we're transforming that into is Buddhahood. This is what is accessible to us in tantric practice. So this is something to keep in mind. And then the other thing to know is that when one has actually developed in tantric practice the ability to correctly perceive emptiness, one can use that subtle in meditation, not when you're dying, or you could do it when you're dying, but we're talking about doing tantric meditation practices. You could use your clear light mind to um, work on purifying, doing the final stages of purification of what are called the obscurations to omniscience. And so this is all built into the technology of the system of what you actually practice in Tantra, especially highest yoga Tantra. And through that practice, one attains what's called one of the two um, bodies of a Buddha. One's called the truth body, and then the other one that is manifested from what's called the subtle wind that always accompanies the most subtle mind. The subtle wind, think of wind as code for body, but not an ordinary body. That is the cause that when you're doing these practices allows the manifestation of the form body of a Buddha. Because that's how a Buddha benefits all sentient beings. And that's why method and wisdom are both important. Because if you don't develop bodhicitta through the method branch or the two wings of practice, along with emptiness, then you can't reach Buddhahood because both are required. Tantra provides a quick way to accomplish both relative to Sutrayana. So speaking of method and wisdom, but before I do that, let me ask, does anybody have any questions so far? Let's see. Question says, we learn that there are ordinary minds and surpassed minds, and there three worldly poisons. Okay, and there are the three worldly poisons. So what are the eight worldly thoughts? Yeah, so I'll tell you what the eight worldly thoughts are in the simplest way. I left my seat because it's easiest to rattle them off, if you will. So the eight worldly thoughts are four pairs of opposites. Um, being happy when we acquire something and unhappy when we don't. Being happy when we feel good and unhappy when we don't. Being happy when we become well known and unhappy when we don't. And being happy when someone speaks well of us and unhappy when someone speaks ill of us. And I had mentioned that specifically in connection with secrecy in Vajrayāna. Well, because then you could see how these specific eight worldly thoughts could manifest very easily, or if you get very prideful with your practice, which is not a good thing. It's not a good thing whatsoever. Any other questions before I continue? Okay. So, so just to stay with talking about method and wisdom, I mentioned that there's these special techniques available to us in Tantra versus Sutrayana practice. but I also haven't really differentiated like, well, what's the big deal? Like, why can't if I'm practicing Sutrayana practice and I'm practicing the two wings of practice of method and wisdom, why can't I just stay with that? Well, you can, um, but there are some differences that I'm going to try to put a spotlight on tonight. But basically, method in Sutrayana practice are those practices that we do when we're practicing the three principal aspects of Mahayana Buddhist practice: renunciation, developing bodhicitta, and wisdom. So doing meditations like on death and impermanence, doing meditations on bodhicitta such as seven-part cause and effect, exchanging self and others, and doing analytical meditations on emptiness when we talk about emptiness. And for the first two parts, renunciation and bodhicitta, that's where we're collecting merit. And for emptiness, for wisdom aspect of the path, the meditations on ultimate reality and the emptiness of inherent existence are the ways that we are uh, collecting virtue and merit relating to wisdom. So in and these are the two that we have to always keep in mind. So far, we haven't heard really too much difference between this and Tantra in terms of if this is what we need to develop fully to then reach the level of Buddhahood where we attain the truth body and the ability to have a form body to benefit all sentient beings. Again, why can't I just stay with what I already know? And so this is something that we want to understand. The first thing, though, I want to say before that is that wisdom of emptiness is the ultimate antidote that we have to bring into our mind stream. It's the ultimate antidote because method practices can help us, like practicing loving kindness, which is a quality of bodhicitta, along with compassion. But they're temporary in living in the life that we live in now as the individuals we are. They can, like love, for example, can reduce the force of anger, but it can't eliminate it. The only way to uproot it is to put the direct perception of emptiness in our mind stream. So this becomes the big focus of practice in Vajrayāna practice. So when we want to talk about the differences, though, between the two, um, there are some differences in even though you can pursue both the development of both qualities, which then become the causes for the eventual reaching of liberation, and then beyond that, Buddhahood. In Sutrayana practice, you're utilizing something called your coarse level mind. You're not utilizing your subtle level mind. Subtle level use of your mind, you'll see, is something much more um, uh, valuable in the sense of being something that will help you move along the path much more quickly. And that's what's available to us in Tantra practice. So this is something to try to realize that by using certain methods that are available in Tantra, we can realize much more quickly emptiness, reaching a place where we can see emptiness directly much more quickly than Sutrayana practice. Because when you're using the coarse level of your mind, the coarse level of your mind is burdened, so to speak, by being contaminated. It's your ordinary mind that has karmic ripenings going on all the time. And tantric practices have techniques that help you move past those to subdue the arising of your coarse level of your minds and access the subtle levels of your mind progressively through meditation practices. And then in doing so, um, one can gain much clearer, more refined um, understandings, ascertainment of emptiness compared to Sutrayana practitioners. So both are positive and wonderful. You gain clarity in the ways that you do course level meditations from Sutrayana practice, and so it's not less in terms of quality, but it is in terms of the clarity and detail of, if you will. And then the other difference between the two is in Sutrayana practice, you have to use analytical meditation. And when you use analytical meditation, you have to switch back and forth out of in and out of analytical meditation, then into like single pointed serenity, where you then take the results of your analysis and bring them into single pointed focus and become and have realizations. In a Vajrayāna practice, you bypass that. You can work directly with manifesting using stabilizing meditation, shamatha, calm abiding, single pointed meditation, um, to 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 access the subtle level of the mind where you ascertain in a much more clear fashion and eventually directly emptiness. So these and there's special techniques and tools available in Vajrayana that provide that opportunity to us. And this is available in all four of the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, um, His Yoga Tantra and the Galupa tradition, Mahamudra practice in both Galupa and Kagyu traditions, what's called Dzogchen in the Yingma tradition, and what's called the indivisibility of bliss and emptiness in the Sakya tradition. So this is like something to also sort of hang your hat on when you're looking at like, well, why would I want to move into the um, tantric path? And so there are special um, techniques that are available to you, especially in highest yoga tantra. And by employing those techniques, you can have that what normally occurs, as I mentioned earlier in passing, at the time of death, the dissolution of death, that innate clear light that appears, you can use that actually in meditation practice and develop to a point where you reach the completion of the path and do it much more quickly. You can eliminate um, all the obscurations that would be in your most subtle mind, having already reduced and subsided your course level minds in the early parts of the tantric practice. And then this is partly why they talk about this being the quick path, because it could be done very quickly. And the other thing to point out, if you really want to actualize an omniscient mind of a Buddha, you have to cultivate its substantial cause. And if you're working with a course level mind, I already pointed out that that's contaminated by our own karma, then that polluted state of mind that has any kind of mental afflictions, ultimately it's temporary. It comes and goes. It comes and goes with each lifetime. And so that's not really a mind that you can ultimately use to reach the end of the path. You can't carry a contaminated mind forward and expect that to provide you with a different result. That defies the law of cause and effect. You can utilize it in Sutrayana practice to get to a certain point, but not complete the path. So this is something that we want to talk about. If you want to reach Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings, then you have to attain an omniscient mind. So you need to cultivate its substantial cause. Working with the subtle mind, then this is much more possible because the subtle mind and the subtle wind joined together are the substantial cause of a Buddha's truth body and form body to benefit all sentient beings. So this is important. Um, then when we talk about method in both Sutrayana and Vajrayāna practice, they are very similar as well. But one of the first things that you look for as a practitioner, you want to look in your heart. And if you've developed from during your Sutrayana practice, renunciation to a degree, bodhicitta to a degree, and emptiness to a degree, which are the three principal aspects of the path in the Sutrayana vehicle, the one you want to look closely at is bodhicitta. How intense is your bodhicitta? How strong is your bodhicitta? Do you have a feeling that you want to, based on your strong renunciation and seeing the suffering that one can see by uh, meditating on the Four Noble Truths and realizing that everyone is suffering? How quickly do you want to help other sentient beings end their suffering? Not just your own, but theirs. You can do it on the Sutrayana path, but it takes a really long time. Or you could do it on the Tantric path, and it could happen a lot more quickly. So they talk about intensity, urgency of your bodhicitta, whether it's an aspiring bodhicitta or you've actualized bodhicitta. So this is something to also keep in mind in terms of like as you're thinking about maybe entering the path. Um, so both Sutrayana and Vajrayana practitioners, though, do engage in the same kind of practices. You have to build the foundation of your practice on um, practicing the bodhisattva activities that are present in the six perfections. So this is something that you want to look at for yourself and see if this is something you have some experience in. You don't have to necessarily perfect them, but you want to have some experience with uh, the meditations on the six perfections. Um, and then when it comes to difference, though, on the method side, is between the two vehicles. In Vajrayana, it involves what's called taking the result of the path. And this is where you actually utilize, as a practitioner, imagining that what is called the four purities, that you have yourself. You take on the purity of body of a Buddha. You take on the purity of the environment of the mandala of that deity. You take on the pure enjoyments and you take on the pure actions of that deity. And this is where you're able to accumulate merit much more quickly. When we were talking about before, we were talking about wisdom. So these are, there's no difference between what you're utilizing, but it's what you're utilizing as the vehicle or the path. So the four purities is a big part of what we utilize in the Vajrayana practice. Um, so I'll stop there and see if anybody else has any questions or no. Let's see. So, question on the chat is substantial cause the same as intention? So, intention is something that is a quality that one puts in one's mind to create virtue in your mind stream. The more you're able to be in a place where your intentions are are built on what's called wishing bodhicitta, aspiring bodhicitta, then that intention infuses your um, your mind stream, where we call that the presence of that, then um, we call the presence of that virtue, actual virtue in your mind stream. And then when we talk about causes, substantial causes, then this is where one is working with um, a quality of oneself, because you have to realize we're talking about utilizing your own mind and body. You are looking to either work with, say, as I was just discussing, for example, working with the coarse level of your mind. And if you utilize that where you're doing the tantric practices or the Sutrayana practices, then you're creating the causes. If you're doing virtuous activities and you're doing meditations on renunciation and bodhicitta and wisdom, every moment you're doing that, you're creating the causes um, to then in the future have the results be something similar in quality and result. So, substantial cause is really talking about the practices that one puts in one's mind stream in that way. And intention is something that is sort of adjacent to that, right? So, if you talk about bodhicitta, then if your intention is aspiring bodhicitta, then doing the meditations that accompany that, like seven-part cause and effect meditation or exchanging self and others, then those meditations then uh, become the causes in your mind stream that then in the future become the substantial causes for having a result that's similar to that. So hopefully that helps. They're sort of adjacent to each other that way.
The John chanting would fit in there.
Absolutely. So also like mantra recitation. Uh, mantra recitation is like considered what's called protection for the mind. So then all these things we're talking about, whether it's Sutrayana or Tantrayana, we're talking about working with our mind and trying to tame our mind, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says. So then if you're occupying your time by, and you'll find out in the next class when I start talking about actual commitments, that part of what you're going to be doing every day is a certain mantra recitation. Then every second you're doing that and you're counting them, you're using your Mahalabis, you're creating protection for your mind, and at the same time, you're putting in your mind, especially if you're doing it very focused, your ordinary thoughts are sort of pushed aside. Then that becomes the quality of your mind, where you're creating causes for future ripening for what those mantras represent in their sound, what they will ripen into. And so mantra, and you'll find out when we talk about it next week, sorry, 2 weeks from now in our next session, they have quality. It's part of the speech. There's the body, speech, and mind of an enlightened being. And so mantras associated with a specific deity in Tantra then help us create and reach the purity of of our speech, not telling lies, not having divisive speech, not using harsh speech, not doing idle gossip. Then where that's gone, and in its place is Vajra speech. Only speak purely, and then mantra is part of that. So same, so very much there. That's a major element of Vajrayāna practice. Okay. Any other questions before I continue? No? Okay. So, hopefully this isn't getting bogged down, but I want you to understand how there are real differences between the two, but they come from common ground. The path isn't really that different, if you will, um, except that one utilizes different tools and techniques and brings us to the end result a lot quicker. Um, so here, I just want to talk for a minute about practicing method and wisdom together. By now, maybe you already kind of got the idea that in Sutrayana practice, you have to alternate between the two because you're alternating between calm abiding meditation and insight meditation or analytical meditation. You can't hold both in your mind at the same time. And this is true in all Sutrayana practice, as well as the three lower tantras, because there's four classes of tantra, which I'll talk more about next session. But in Vajrayāna practice, there's special techniques. So also then in the three lower tantras and also in highest yoga tantra, where you can do meditations on emptiness, on method and wisdom together. And then in highest yoga tantra, there's methods to do them simultaneously. And this is another thing that allows one to move quickly on the path. Um, they say that engaging in the meditation practices that are available to us to develop method and wisdom in Sutrayana practice takes 3 eons. And in Tantric practice, it could be as short as one human lifetime. And then we could talk more about that too as we move along. So in highest yoga tantra, the methods that we use to be able to attain simultaneously using meditation on method and wisdom are due to the special objects of focus. Now, remember, I can't go into too much detail here into specific tantric practices because that's not allowed. But I can talk about this, which is that by working with special objects, like working with the deity's mandala, uh, appearing in your meditation, once you learn the mandala's details closely, where you visualize it in a tiny drop, and you can see all the details. Um, and placing it maybe at different what are called chakras in your body, crown, throat, heart, navel, then this explodes the development of your concentration, your serenity. Remember, I told you, along with method and wisdom, you need that. You can't reach Buddhahood without having that. So this is another sort of, rocket booster that is put on your practice of developing method and wisdom if you're using Vajrayāna practices versus Sutrayana practices, because it's not possible to utilize these same kinds of objects. Um, and remembering you're also utilizing these objects as yourself appearing with the four purities, including yourself appearing as the deity, then these are all very special features that are not present in Sutrayana. Um, so this is it's kind of crucial to keep these kind of things in mind. Um, and remembering also that one of the things that working with these objects, you're working with your subtle mind. And when you're working with your subtle mind, I mentioned it earlier, but it's always accompanied by your subtle wind. So those are the two aspects of your mind and body in its most subtlest form. In Sutrayana practice, that's not present. You're working with the mind in an analytical way, not so much even with the body. Um, Matter of fact, appearances, both of yourself and phenomena, you kind of in an analytical emptiness meditation in Sutrayana, you have the object sort of disappear. It's a negation of the ordinary object, and you're left with the negation of that, and that's what emptiness is. But in Sutrayana and in Tantrayana practice, you actually embrace all appearance in an enlightened form and have a clear meditative state where you are visualizing all objects, including yourself, as nothing more than the appearance of what's called emptiness in union with bliss. And bliss is a special method that's used in Tantrayana practice. So, in short, there's no difference between the two paths. I don't want you to get confused. It's just that one utilizes different meditative techniques that works a lot more quickly. And actually, before we move on, let's see. There's another question, and then I'm going to share a document with you. is subtle wind always moving and energy? So, yes, it is energy. Wind, sometimes it's called air, AIR. Sometimes it's called energy. But all of those are synonymous with um, the body. Um, Obviously, the coarsest level of our body is this thing, but the wind in tantric practice is synonymous with body, and the more subtle the wind is, then this is like what you're attaining, working with, I should say. And is it always moving? Yes, normally. But one of the goals of getting to a place where you bring the winds in your mind um, into a place of complete stillness, which is one of the goals of practice. Um, in completion stage practice, they call it bringing it into the central channel at your heart center. And when you're able to do that, the mind in union with your wind is at complete rest. All conceptualizations, all dualistic experiences um, are suspended. So it is always moving normally. And on its coarsest level, it's like when you sit down to meditate and you are just trying to focus on your breath and you have those thoughts you become aware of racing through your mind. Those thoughts are mind conjoined with wind moving. They're moving throughout your body. They're moving um, uh, throughout your mind, and they're moving throughout all of existence. And their quality, being virtuous or non-virtuous, that's another matter, you know. Um, so another question, would you be so kind as to write down the practices for us so it's not to be to remember? Yeah, at the point. Yeah, so yeah, one of the things that I'm doing right now, I'm going to show you on the screen um, a list. Let me bring this up for you. Hold on a second. I'm a little bit slow at this kind of thing. Here we go. And I'll send this through on the chat before we hang up tonight. I just want to be sure everybody was in before I did this. Let me share the screen. Okay. So on the screen, you should be able to see this is a bullet list of like kind of taking a lot of what you heard me say tonight and then some. And it talks about the differentiate differences between highest yoga tantra and sutra that make highest yoga tantra more profound. And I won't go through this because it will take too much time in terms of me wanting to finish up tonight and take more questions. But you can look at this between now and the next session and let me know if you have any questions about it or want me to go back and focus on one. So, like, you might read like the third bullet here where it says, the subtlest mind, the fundamental innate mind of clear light, is used to realize emptiness, and meditating with this mind quickly eliminates obscurations. You might go, what? So, again, you could feel free to, want to maybe explore this a little bit further with me. So there's a whole bunch of things here about a pit. Yeah, it's not meant to have an empty bullet there, although that might be auspicious. And then let me see what other questions we have. Um, okay. Okay, so Linda is asking, how is bliss described? So bliss is a special method in Tantra that is the development of on the method side, and it is in meditation on the deity and generation stage practice, we utilize certain practices that have to do with visualizing the deity, doing certain activities, doing certain kind of um, meditation in connection with that, which ripens the our ability to eventually on what's called the completion stage to actually um, do really advanced practices where once we get to a certain level with using our subtle mind, we can attain what's called an impure illusory body. And this is a body that is almost before one reaches the end of the path. And it becomes the body eventually, the form body of a Buddha, the one that then emanates to benefit all sentient beings. So, this is what you can do. And this is why you want to use bodhicitta as a primary motivation for that part of the practice. But when we talk about bliss, Linda, we're talking about practices during completion stage that generate bliss. I don't want to go into too much detail because it'd take too much time and become like super like what? But there are practices in highest yoga tantra where one can generate what are called the four joys, both the descending and ascending order. And through those practices, one is generating bliss, and that becomes the basis for the illusory body. So hopefully that answers your question as far as that goes, at least preliminarily. Um, okay, so it says, okay, where do we find what I'm posting? I'm going to put it in the chat, and I'll do that. I'll do that before we hang up, before we close up the session. So you don't have to worry about downloading it. You can download it from the chat, and I'll put it up there well before we end the session. Okay. Um, so that's the list. And so I won't go into the list, but what I want to do is um, just underscore for you that what we're utilizing when we do go onto the tantric path is we're primarily utilizing the development of using our most subtle mind versus a course level mind. And in doing so, we are able to reach more subtle levels of meditation, both in generation and completion stage practice, which are the two um, main practices in highest yoga tantra. And through doing that, we have certain tools available to us that are delineated in the actual practices that help us work with reaching the state of being able to work with our most subtle mind, and that we can attain clarity on the union of emptiness and bliss, which are the things that we are looking to develop ultimately to reach the end of the path. So the inseparability of method and wisdom, being able to practice them simultaneously, is one of the substantial causes of reaching Buddhahood, because when one reaches Buddhahood, one has to be able to um, not only attain a truth body, but simultaneously a form body. And actually, there's two form bodies, but I don't want to make things confusing. Um, so that isn't possible in Sutrayana practice. In Sutrayana practice, even if someone is a high level bodhisattva, for example, and has reached a very high level of deep meditation practice, where they're constantly in perfect meditation, in 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 um, uh, in our cosmology of advanced Buddhist practices, we call those levels the Bodhisattva grounds or the Bodhisattva bhumis. And the more advanced you get and in your practices, then you can benefit all kinds of sentient beings while remaining in complete meditative equipoise. But even someone who's traveled the Sutrayana path to reach one of those levels can't, they can only clearly see the object, clear light, emptiness, with flawlessly, without break, with deep meditative concentration. But they can't conjoin that with the mind, the subject, clear light mind, the mind that's actually observing that emptiness, observing that object clear light, where they bring them together in union. And that can only happen on the highest yoga tantra path. And so even an advanced practitioner of the Sutrayana path who might take 3 eons to do their practice has to eventually move over, so to speak. They're not really moving over, but let's say there's a bodhisattva on the 10th bodhisattva ground. That's the last ground, by the way, before one reaches the path of no more learning. They have to engage in the specific practices of highest yoga tantra at that point in order to attain the final union of bliss and emptiness, of the object clear light emptiness and the wisdom of the mind, the subject, knowing it and bringing them into union. It removes the final moment of duality that we mistakenly experience. And that's that. And so even for someone at that level, then this is what has to happen. So this is another thing that's pointed out in a lot of the text on this topic about comparing the two ways of moving forward. So I'll wrap up tonight, though, by just talking about highest yoga tantra and comparing it in one big overview to the Sutrayana path. So, first of all, I'll say that first thing that makes the Vajrayāna path fast is that the all 4 classes of Tantra do speak of that. But the 3 lower Tantras, which I'll talk about more next time, um, have methods that are more about extending a practitioner's lifespan so that they have more time to practice, basically. But in highest yoga tantra, the accomplishment of generating great bliss, um, dissolving all the winds into the central channel, which I mentioned earlier, at the heart center, um, accessing the subtle level of the mind and generating the illusory body, all these things that might sound like, if you're not familiar with the terminology and all of that, it might sound a little bit like too much to grasp, but just know that all of that is what's available in highest yoga tantra. And then specifically, when we talk about highest yoga tantra, it basically, as I already said, it enables you to reach the end of the path much more quickly than Sutrayana path. Um, and the other thing to note is that some of you might know, or all of you might know, that there are 5 paths that make up the entire path, Buddhist path. Path of accumulation, which is where you're accumulating virtue and merit. The path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditative habituation, and the path of no more learning. They're all 5 paths are present both in Tantra and in Sutra. So, like, you don't have to feel like if you go onto the Tantric path, you're missing something. Um, so the difference is, though, that the Sutrayana path does take the first path of accumulation. It's said that it takes uh, uh, 3 countless great eons to complete the accumulation of merit and wisdom necessary to attain a form body and a truth body of a Buddha. But the special techniques available in highest yoga tantra enable it much quicker. I've already said that, right? But the first countless great eon in Sutrayana is spent practicing the path of accumulation and the path of preparation. And those 2 paths are synonymous in Tantra with the path that's known as generation stage. So if one completes the generation stage practice, you've completed the entire path of accumulation and preparation, which normally take one of those 3 great eons. And that can be done in as little as one lifetime. And again, because of the special methods that are available. And then the path of the second uh, uh, great eon is where one gets to a point on the Sutrayana path of reaching the path of seeing emptiness directly. And and that's the same as the practices in Vajrayāna, where you're using bliss as a method on the completion stage practice, and that can happen very quickly. And it actually, when it does happen, it happens in one meditation session. There's a moment, it's an event, it's a singular event where the union of bliss and emptiness become fully revealed at a single moment. And that's not the fourth stage of clear light of the completion stage. That's just the label I'm giving you. And then the third countless grade eon in Sutrayana practice is the practices that are done by a bodhisattva on the eighth, ninth, and 10th bodhisattva grounds. Um, and this is where a practitioner vanquishes all final little obscurations that might exist in their mind stream. And this is accomplished much more quickly in highest yoga tantra by generating the illusory body united with the actual clear light. So this is just comparing how the entire path is present in a specific tantric practice. It just looks different. It has different practices associated with it as one traverses the entire path. So, yeah, I'll end my talk by just reading what Jason Kappa has to say about highest yoga tantra um, in his text called "The Lamp Illuminating the Five Stages of the Completion Stage," and this is where he talks about how the paths and grounds have the same names in Sutra and Tantra, but they're not quite the same. So it's kind of important. Again, if you're especially somebody who's thinking about entering the tantric path, moving from the sutra path. But even if you're already a tantric practitioner, it's good to know this. So he says the path of accumulation extends from the common path up to, but not including, the ability to directly induce the empties by causing the winds to enter and dissolve in the central channel by the power of meditation. So right there, he's telling you the first, like, sort of barrier that you can do these practices of accumulation on the sutra path, never mind how long it takes. I've already articulated that, but he's also saying, but you can't actually do that, reach that final step, if you will, where you dissolve the winds into your central channel, which is important in the method of being able to use our precious human body in a very purposeful way in meditation practice. And then the path of preparation extends from the capacity to do that up to, but not including, the illusory body directly realizing suchness through bliss. So it's similar. There's something not quite the same. And that's partly why it takes so long. The path of seeing, the ground of the very joyful, extends from the actual clear light up to, but not including, the attainment of union. That's the final step. The nine grounds of the path of meditation, that's the fourth part, the step on of the five paths, extends from the learner's union up to, but not including, attaining the non-learner's union, which is Buddhahood. So he's telling you right there that the end of the Sutrayana path has to move on to the Tantric path. So this is all part of trying to delineate all this so that once one sees the difference between the two, Jason Kappa says that we'll see the superiority of Tantrayana practice and want to then be inspired to enter the Tantric path, developed on a firm foundation of renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom. That has part of that being the six perfections, and then moving on to then being open to receiving the empowerments, which we'll talk about next session. And then we'll proceed with enthusiasm to want to engage in the tantric vows and commitments, and all the other practices that it involves. And that's what I'm going to be laying out in next session are the practices that are involved because it's only fair. His Holiness says it's only fair that you know what they are before you make the commitment. Because if you do so beforehand, you might go, oh, I didn't know this was everything that I was going to have to do in my practice. And then this could be, sort of a false start. And again, that's the spirit of why we want to first tonight was laying out for you the difference between Sutrayana path and Vajrayāna path. And I know it's in a sort of, I threw a lot at you, but also I did it in a sketch fashion with leaving out some of the details, trying to give you the specifics enough so that you can clearly see that there are advantages, as Jason Kappa says, to taking the tantric path if one is interested in reaching Buddhahood for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then next session, we'll go into, okay, if I'm going to enter this path, what's really required of me? Let me see what's in the chat right now. Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, someone may be confused as to the Zoom link on the page is giving March. Oh, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, by the way. One of the people is mentioning that the Zoom link, if you read the actual on the DNKL calendar, there are dates for these three sessions. The dates for these three sessions are today, April 3rd, then April 17th, and then May 1st. At the bottom of the description, it gives earlier dates. And that's because originally this class was supposed to occur um, uh, earlier, but then it was actually delayed. And so that's the reason those dates are incorrect. So don't pay attention to those. If you were paying attention to them, you wouldn't even be here because they are already passed. Um, and then the next question here, is it possible to get a recording of this class? Yes, uh, Shopal's recording, and then he'll post it. Shopal, right? You'll post it.
Yeah, yeah, I'll post it later tonight.
Yeah. Okay. And then Louise is asking, please, what's the title of this text again? Okay, so there's not a specific text to what I'm teaching. I'm teaching based on a number of texts that are uh, available to us as practitioners. And so I can give you a syllabus that of where, but it's also a little bit overwhelming, but I could do that. Oh, the last one by Jason Kappa. Okay. So that comes from Jason Kappa's text where I was reading where he's doing the comparison between the five stages of the path of Sutra and Tantra. That comes from his text on Highest Yoga Tantra called Lamp, Illuminating the Five Stages of the Completion Stage. Um, I can provide information on, there is an English translation of that. Um, it's really intense. And it's like a book like this thick, which I'm fine. I'll share that with you and I'll provide a link to it. I think it's published as part of the Library of Tibetan Classics, which Wisdom Publication publishes. So it's like, that's a really deep, but that answers your question. Yeah. Let's see, other questions on the chat. Uh, okay, I gotta post this. So you gotta give me a second because I'm terrible at posting. How do I post a text on the chat?
You can just drag it and drop it there and it'll create a file.
Thank you. Let me see if I can actually do that. I'm sure I
And
can.
I'll be finished in 15 minutes.
Okay. Difference between Sutra and Tantra. I could just drag this into any place. It didn't work.
Yeah, drag it into like where you would type a message.
Got it. Okay. It's there. It's just a Word document. Or actually, it's in Pages on mine because I use an Apple computer. But if you download it, you can open it in any word processor.
You have to hit enter after you drag it and drop it there.
Thank you. See how much help I need. I'm a real Luddite when it comes to using this. Okay. Okay, so Mary's asking, where do we look for the post of the class? Shopal, like where will she find?
I put the link in there where it says dnkl.org/previous teachings and courses.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, so there you go.
It's
Uh,
yeah, the way. I don't know why.
so can you see can you see what I put?
No, it's not there.
No.
Oh, how come that happened? Oh, it's only gone to one person. That's why
Oh, okay, that's why. Yeah, you have to make
I have to change it to everybody in the meeting. Let me do it again. Okay. For some reason, I only had it going to one person. Now you can see it.
Hey,
yeah,
we got it.
thank you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So hopefully this wasn't like too overwhelming and or confusing or not in focus. Um, any additional comments, thoughts, or questions for me? Nothing. So
I
that's
think we need to know what the practices we are supposed to be doing in the interim.
yes. Okay. So next session, I'm going to cover for you from a 30,000 foot view, as they like to say, um, what's involved in actually entering the path. And that means what kind of vows and commitments you have to make, what kind of, when I say vows and commitments, I'm talking about actually what you receive during the empowerment in terms of vows and commitments that you have to keep daily. And also, I'll explain what the empowerment ceremony actually looks like, what actually occurs during an empowerment ceremony,
Mhm.
what actually happens between you and the Vajra master, and then what practices you will have to do daily. And so that's not hard to cover. That's easier to cover than like what I covered tonight because this is more about like getting in and looking at like what the practice entails. And then the last session, I'm going to go into talking a little bit more closely, like with a focus, like what I sketched out tonight, which is what the tantric practices actually look like, you know? Um, so let's see if there's anything else in the chat. There was something about needing to talk with a teacher whose name I can't remember. Okay, yeah, right. Oh, the list is downloading is gibberish for me. Oops. So maybe what I should do is let me save this as a PDF. How about that? Because I sent you like a Word document. Let me do that. I'm saving it as a PDF. And then I am going to post that. How about that? Maybe that would work.
And you can drag that too.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to try to do. Now I'm
Actually, the
like,
first one I got, okay, but so maybe it's just a different computer.
yeah, what happens is if you maybe try to open it with a program that doesn't want to work. Okay, I've just sent a PDF. So let me know if that works for you. So anyway, that's what I'm going to be covering over the next two classes. Again, to finish the thought about the third class, it will be where I take a lot of the concepts we talked about tonight and put them into a little bit more focus in terms of what it means to be practicing generation stage and what it means to be practicing completion stage. So for those who aren't familiar with those, as I mentioned them tonight, they might have been like, again, like, what? What's he talking about? But His Holiness says, like, with tantric practice and learning about these kinds of concepts and practices for the first time, like with all Buddhist practices, the first time you hear them, any kind of teaching about them, it's like you're never going to get it all. That's just the way it is. I mean, I've been practicing Tantra for almost 20 years, and like every time I meditate, something else happens, so to speak. And then when I read a commentary, it's like, whoa, I didn't see that before. So, and I mean that literally. And that's the nature of dependent arising. You're dependent arising with the practice. As you change, the practice changes with you, whatever you need. Then the
Mm-hmm.
commentaries you read, it's like, oh, you
Mm-hmm.
couldn't see what was there before because you weren't reading it there. It's so multidimensional. And that's also one of the things about Tantra that is different from Sutrayana practice. It's so experiential. And it's one of the reasons you need to have a Lama who you can work with once you enter the tantric path. But that's all part of what I'm going to talk about next session. I don't want to jump into that tonight. So if there's no more questions, then I can wait. Let's see if there are. I just have a couple of thanks. Okay, well, hopefully this wasn't too overwhelming and you'll come back next week because it will be different and it will be more expansive and hopefully provide some insight as I just outlined. And then we'll have a third session, which will end on May 1st. And all three of these sessions are meant also to be to take place, hopefully in preparation for some of you who might be thinking about taking the tantric initiation, which will be starting that weekend at DNKL. There'll be a tantric initiation starting on Yamantaka, and then the following weekend it will be completed. The schedule's online at DNKL's calendar. And then also there'll be an empowerment, what's called the blessing of Vajrayogini, which is a second set of tantric empowerments happening that following Sunday, whatever that date is. So over 2 successive weekends, right after I finish this 3-part series, there'll be some auspicious tantric initiations and empowerments happening at DNKL. So that's why we want to make sure we offered this before that occurred. All right. All right. So I think well, let me just see if there's anything else. People saying thank you. That's nice because I don't want to feel like I'm hanging up and people are going, oh God, that was crazy. All right. I think you can stop the recording, Shopal.